Welcome to the speaker series on a shot glass of recovery.
Yeah. You get a house, you get a car, then you start thinking that's all you are, but you don't know the truth. So let me spell it out for you. Now I got your attention, now there's a start. Now sit and listen to my favorite part. Life's been giving us some clues. The answer lies inside of you.
Hi, I'm Lisa, and welcome to A Shot Glass of Recovery. This is the Speakers Series edition of the show, where we bring to you another great speaker from our morning meeting AA Solution Seekers. You can look for us at Online Intergroup AA or Toronto Intergroup AA. And before we get into our speaker for today, I just wanted to do a couple of show notes off the top. One, I want to thank Yvonne, the singer, for lending us that song, Sonya Galaxy. It's been a great intro for the speaker series. For the regular podcast, A Shot Glass of Recovery, where you might hear a journal entry, you might hear Lisa's Trauma Tuesday as I work through things with results from therapy. You might hear just pontifications or readings or just my everyday thoughts on recovery. For that one, Yvonne wrote on the fly a personal intro for this show, and I was just blown away by her talent. So we always want to thank Yvonne for her gifts and her generosity for letting us use her music on our show. One more show note, if you do like the show, please like, follow, support it on Instagram, on Podbean, on iTunes Podcast and Spotify. That would be great. It generates more listeners when the show rises in the ranks. And lastly, I do pay for this out of my own pocket. If you could see it in your heart to drop $1, $5, $10, consider it a tip, if you will. You can drop that in my PayPal account, A Shot Glass of Recovery. Any amount would be much appreciated. You can find the link to the PayPal in the show notes on this podcast. All right, and now without further ado, let's hear today's speaker on A Shot Glass of Recovery.
Thank you. Feels good to get quiet like that, doesn't it? That's not how I've spent most of my life. And I'm about to enter my 60th year this April. And 50 of those years, 50 of those years have been struggling with this dis-ease one way or another. Some of them sober, but most of them not. But I'll tell you my story as I go along. But I thought maybe I'd start today by reflecting on my dog walk this morning. It's a nice cold day and I've been out with the dog. Sometimes I use dog to remind me of God, but sometimes not. But I love walking with the dog, and I was walking with a dog and thinking with God, and I would never have said that a few years ago, but thinking with God about this meeting. And then I listened to some music, and it reminded me of much of the past. And it was a song by an Irish band called U2. And it goes, "I still haven't found what I'm looking for." And that was the story of my life. And there's probably another one, if you're old enough to remember it, called "I Just Can't Get No Satisfaction." And my goodness me, was that the story of my life? And earlier, well, I was going to say earlier this year, it was actually last year, I was lucky enough to go to the Royal Albert Hall in London and saw one of my favorite artists, David Gilmour, who played guitar for Pink Floyd. And the last time I'd seen him was when I was 15 in 1980. And he played my favorite song both times, "Comfortably Numb." And so those are sort of three songs that I'd like to start this speaker session with. And they feature in everything about the problem that I've wrestled with for so many years. And "Comfortably Numb" was really where I wanted to be. I really did want to be comfortably numb because I couldn't get any satisfaction at all. And I could never find what I was looking for. And where I am today is, quite surprisingly, I found what I was looking for. I didn't expect it. I didn't expect it to find it where it came from. And more of the time than not, I'm at peace. And I'm incredibly grateful for that. And it's AA and all of you guys and the fellowship of AA that have brought me to that place. Now, before I go on, I need to introduce you to a character that's going to feature quite a lot in the next few minutes. And that's someone I call Little Dave. And Little Dave has run my life for most of my life. I'm not sure when he was born. He might have been there right at the beginning. He might have appeared in the first few months or first couple of years, probably the first few months. As he started to realize that he was a separate entity and started to build stories around what he wanted and the difference between him and everything else and everyone else. And of course, what I call Little Dave, and I'll talk about him quite a lot, is another name for ego, really. And by ego, I don't mean, when I think of ego, necessarily big-headed and grandiose, although Little Dave definitely is. And if he appears in the next 40 minutes or so, my sincere apologies. It can happen. But usually he's quiet at times like this. And none of you are going to speak and trigger him. So maybe we'll be okay. We'll be safe from him for a while. But he does have this sort of massive ego and very, very small self-esteem, very, very low self-esteem. And it's been built up over the years and perfected over the years. And I now see that Little Dave is the root cause of many of my problems. And if I had one thing to kind of give to a newcomer or anybody really, it would be, and it's taken me so long to realize this, that the discomfort that I felt living with Little Dave, the discomfort I felt living with that part of myself that could never be happy and never be satisfied and was intolerable a lot of the time, that discomfort I tried to treat with alcohol. And it worked quite a lot of the time. It worked. And usually I was seeking oblivion. I was trying to get numb, comfortably numb, and to quiet down that voice of Little Dave. And what I've found is it's a failed treatment plan. Alcohol does not treat that condition. It makes it worse, ultimately. It fools us into thinking it's solving the problems. It's helping me to get quiet. But rather than taking me to a quiet which is about being more conscious and more awake, it's making me unconscious. It takes me down rather than up. And it feeds all of the things that I'll talk about to do with Little Dave in due course and makes them worse. So alcohol is a failed treatment plan for this problem we call alcoholism. Alcoholism, I now see it as the human condition, actually. It's just we've treated it with alcohol. But you may not all see it that way, but that's how I see it. It's learning to live with oneself and the rest of the world. And it's a difficult thing to do if you're like me. And so you treat it with alcohol. And I became addicted to alcohol, and it just made things worse. Perhaps to sort of focus a little bit on the human condition, and I'll come back to it. But I'm certainly not a religious person, so please, if you're bothered by God and those sorts of notions, don't hear this as me being religious. But I've spent a lot of time wondering, why is it that AA has a spiritual solution to this problem of alcoholism? Why does it have to be spiritual? And what I came to realize was that the answer's never out there. It's in here. And I spent my whole life looking for things to help me and little Dave feel better. Alcohol was just one of them, right? But drugs was part of my journey too. And so was chasing after all sorts of other obsessions, shiny things, sex, power, titles, awards, anything I could find to distract me from that discomfort, from that irritableness, discontent that I felt living living in the same body as this little guy who's so difficult. Um, so maybe I go back. I was going to say religion, it's not about religion, but when I look at all of the major religions, I've now realized that they all have the same sorts of things in common. And AA is definitely not a religion and it's not a dogma. Thank God. We can do it our own way. But it has some stuff in common, right? And at the heart of all of the religions, you find this thing that the Christians call it sin. It's missing the mark. The Buddhists call it dukkha. Some people say that means suffering. I think it means a wheel that's out of kilter, doesn't quite roll right. It's always a bit off center. The Hindus call it Maya, the veils of delusion. I heard someone, apologies for the language, I'm British, I'll be a bit blue every now and then, but I heard someone recently say it's that human propensity to fuck things up. And it is, right? And so that's at the core of all belief systems, and it's at the core of AA too, really. And what those different traditions do is try and teach us to kind of live with that and deal with that. And for me, what I discovered is the AA program is the only thing I've found that helps me treat that condition which is being at dis-ease with myself and little Dave and the world, of being human, actually. It helps me treat living with being human. What I thought I'd do is just go back a little bit in my journey and tell you some things about myself and how I qualify to be here, calling myself an alcoholic. Although, as I've already said, I don't think it really matters whether I call myself an alcoholic or not. I had my first blackout drunk when I was 10 years old in 1975. I was brought up in a family where I had a father who was a very black and white thinker, very volatile. Not physically aggressive, but abusive in other ways. And he suffers from radical Catholicism. And the ism stands for I, self, me, I think. There are other things it can stand for. But his way of treating his discomfort was to pour himself into Catholicism, right? To escape living with himself. And little Bob, as I now think of him. So part of my journey was I grew up with that, right? And all of the things that go up with growing in a radically Catholic family, which isn't much fun, I have to tell you, from my perspective. The other thing that I had was at a very early age, that when I was 6 or 7, I was molested by a male babysitter. And I didn't have the courage or the ability to articulate what had happened or tell anybody for almost 50 years. I lived with the shame and the embarrassment and the guilt and that feeling that there was something wrong with me and maybe something, I just never felt quite enough. And I remember the situation quite well, and in times when we don't understand what to do, we either freeze or we fight and flee. And in what I did was I freeze and please. Right, I did what I had to do as a little boy who didn't know what was going on. Now I don't blame that person now. I don't look at it like that. That's part of my journey, and in some ways I'm grateful for it, because every part of my journey has brought me to where I am. And I said at the beginning, I'm in a place of peace a lot of the time, and I've found something I think of as God, which I would never have imagined after the Catholicism I was subjected to. So that was my kind of early career. I started at age 10. It was with homemade red wine. I drank 2 bottles, took some homemade hosts made out of white bread at the same time, in isolation in my bedroom, threw up all over the bathroom, cleaned everything up, hid the bottles under the bed, and was asked, well, what are these empty bottles doing the next morning? And quick as a flash, I lied that they were for a school project. And how my parents didn't know what was going on, I don't know, right? Through my teenage years, I drank and drank and drank a lot. When I was 14, I was going to the local disco and drinking half a bottle of vodka on the way there. I got picked up when I was about 14 by my mother. I'd spent all evening with my head down the toilet at a party. There was only one toilet at the party. So the men were peeing over the top of my head and the ladies were going up the road somewhere else. And the question I got from my parents the next morning was, did someone spike your drink? Yeah, right. Despite all of that and the madness of my teenage years, I somehow scraped into university, right? And part of my story that made it so difficult for me to stop all of the madness was denial, right? I denied that I had a problem. And the reason I denied I had a problem was if you were to judge me from the outside, you'd see me as quite successful. Little Dave did well. About the same age, when I was 10 as my first blackout, I decided that I was going to be a leader in the world. I don't know. I mean, whether that was grandiosity, I don't know, right? But anyway, I set my sails on being of importance and leading people. Poor people. But that's what I set out on the boat of life to do. So I managed to get into university despite my teenage years with drugs and alcohol. The alcohol didn't stop. I stopped using the drugs. I decided they were illegal and dangerous. So I'd stick to the safe stuff. And I did it in greater and greater volumes. I got myself a PhD. I went to one of the best universities in the world as a postdoctorate, as a scientist. I'd started out as an arts student. So I decided I was a superhero because I could change from arts to sciences. And look how great I am. I worked with some of the best people in one of the best universities in the world. And then I went to one of the biggest companies in the world and started to climb the corporate ladder and got most of the way to the top. And by the time I was in my early 30s, I had let myself loose on the world in a really mad way. I mean, I'd moved from London to Vietnam to Scotland to Venezuela. And I'd found myself in Houston in Texas. Those of you that are particularly astute will realize I might have been in the oil industry. I found myself in Houston and I was going places. I was single, I had lots of money, I drove around drunk a lot. That didn't matter in Venezuela. You were supposed to. It's too dangerous to do anything else. You couldn't take a taxi and you certainly wouldn't stop at red traffic lights. So I took that to Houston with me. Not a good idea. And I on the 30th of May, 1999, I drove home blackout drunk at 100 miles an hour in a sports car. And I woke up the next morning, not remembering where the car was, but realizing what I'd done yet again, and cringing, and thought, I just cannot go on like this. And I phoned AA on Memorial Day, the Americans call it. I know a lot of you are Canadians, so I won't insult you by mixing you up. But Memorial Day in the US, 31st of May, 1999, I went to my first AA meeting. And unfortunately, this sounds like a good news story, right? Doesn't it? But I didn't get it. I didn't get it. So I walked in, as many of us have done, to that first meeting, full of fear, full of anxiety, full of absolute humiliation and defeat, and depressed, really, that my life had come to this. And I found love and welcome and friendship, but I didn't hear the message. I didn't understand. And again, if you're new, this is not about stopping drinking. This is not about stopping drinking. That sounds counterintuitive. This is about changing the thinking that leads to the drinking. This is about not starting again. That's what I've discovered. But I wasn't ready to learn that in my early 30s, unfortunately. It took me a couple more decades of experimentation and hard work. And little Dave, who I was talking about earlier, who was doing so well by this stage, moved back to Scotland to continue on his career path. And he was now on the executive development program of this massive company, headed for the top. And so, of course, all of that fed his grandiosity, but he started drinking again. And where was I going? I suppose where I was going was that, he knew he had a problem, right? He'd been to an AA meeting, but what he didn't know was that he couldn't deal with it by himself. And it took another 20 years of experimentation and then ultimately sufficient humiliation to become humble enough to realize that little Dave couldn't do it by himself, even though he'd succeeded in so many things in life. And he did, right? Went on to be near the very top of this global international company, moved to go and be at the top of another one that wasn't quite as big. Got married, goodness knows why. Ended up with 3 children under the age of 2 years and 2 days. They all have their birthdays this month. The eldest will be 22 and the twins will be 20 2 days after she's 22. And the wife and the kids became a reason for little Dave to feel ever more resentful and stressed and angry with the world. And so what you got through that period, and I'll get to the recovery in a moment, but through that period, it wasn't so much the amount of drinking, but the progression that we all read about and hear about in AA definitely kicked in. And I drank ever more in an ever more isolated way because my wife didn't like my drinking, of course. So I used to hide it. I started sneaking. I started lying. I started crossing red lines. I started doing things I said I wouldn't do, driving around drunk with the kids in the car. I got noisier inside. I got angrier inside. I got more resentful. I got more judgmental of everybody and everything. I got more selfish. And I've always been a talented manipulator. Little Dave's great at that because he learned to stay safe by smelling the wind, by being hypervigilant, hypersensitive, avoiding the bullies, tucking in behind the right people, pleasing at the right time, So I was very good at manipulating and staying safe and getting away with things, but became more and more detached from anything and everything, more and more deluded, more and more frightened, more and more alone, and more full of self-hate. And by June 2020, kind of the crash and burn started to happen. And I got up one day and I wrote down in my notebook, and I've still got the notes in front of me, how I was feeling. And I wrote, overwhelmingly sad, tired, lonely, self-abused, ignored, fat, bald, lumpy, ugly, talentless, a failure, hopeless, taken for granted, unloved, soulless, envious, foolish, friendless, constrained, damaged, downtrodden, ashamed, regretful, embarrassed, exasperated, dead, angry, exclamation mark, and wanting to wash it all away into oblivion. And that was where I'd come to by the time I was 55. That was where I'd got to. And I'd stopped drinking many times, right? We all know how to do that. I'd pressed the stop it button so many times. And I'd usually then kick in the program of Little Dave. And it was, quite often it was successful, right? It was, I stopped for a year, trained myself to run a marathon, ran the London Marathon 1 year. I stopped another year, a few years later, trained myself to run a marathon, ran a Houston Marathon in 2010. Did lots of saunering, read lots of spiritual books, I remember reading Wayne Dyer's books a lot, being in balance. Um, Typically, I was doing that whilst quaffing a bottle or two of red wine, actually, which didn't help me stay in balance, that's for sure. But I did a lot of that. But the one thing I never ever did was ask anybody else for help. Never. So when I finally came back to AA after my last drink, which was the 5th of April 2021, which was not so long ago, it was because I had convinced myself and shown myself over and over and over again I couldn't do it by myself and I needed help. And I didn't know how to stay stopped. And the last time I did it on the program of Dave, I stopped for 4 years, right? So you can imagine that that fed into the grandiosity and the ego quite a lot, because if I can stop for 4 years under my own doing, I certainly don't need you lot. And anyway, you're all just addicted to this nonsense called AA and meetings, right? So why would I trade one joyful, fun-packed addiction for another? That's just stupid, right? Well, what I now realize is addiction is something that you do, I do, that has negative consequences. But despite those negative consequences, and despite wanting not to do it, I keep doing it. That's addiction. Now, AA doesn't have any negative consequences that I'm aware of. And I could stop. My head usually doesn't like it much after a while, but I could certainly stop. I'm not addicted to AA in the same kind of way. It's a nonsense. But that was the story I told myself. I talked quite a bit about ego and this business of little Dave, and I don't know whether I've really got across what kind of a beast he is. But the reason it's a spiritual program is that ego has to be smashed. Little Dave has got to go. And there are a number of paradoxes about recovery and AA. And one of them is you have to die in order to live. And I don't mean this, they don't mean me, they mean little Dave. The guy that's been running the show's got to go, right? The other paradoxes that I've learned along the way are you have to suffer to heal. You have to suffer enough. And we all suffer to different extents, right? Some of you sank very low, very fast. I don't know whether I did. I think I just stank for a very long time. So it wasn't the depths to which I sank. It was really the length of time for which I stank. But, I did end up doing all those things, right? Hiding my empties in your bins, taking the dog out for a pee when it didn't need one, keeping bottles stashed all over the place, lying at work, lying at home, all of that stuff. I'm glad to say for the last almost 4 years, there hasn't been any of that. And that's because I started to do the things in AA that I was told to do. And they have changed my life. I have absolutely no doubt about that. Now, I started to do some of those things before I came into AA. And this is my story rather than a potted AA story, so I'm going to tell it. But I think there are parallels, right? So that rock bottom, which happened in June of 2020, when I read out all of that stuff to you of how I was feeling about myself, I had 3 or 4 days when I kind of couldn't leave the room that I'm sat in now. I didn't speak to my 3 children, my wife, or even the dog. And after that, I decided that I needed to do something. But I did something that I'd never done before. Instead of reading all of the self-help books and the spiritual books that I used to read, I started to do some of the things that they suggested. You see, I used to be an expert on what you should do, but I never used to do it. I knew all about meditation, but I didn't actually meditate. I knew all about, I'd read all of Tony Robbins' books and knew all about NLP, but I hadn't actually done very much of it. And the same would be true of almost anything I can think of in this dimension, right? So I did a few simple things. I decided that I wanted to have a future where I was sober. At that point, I didn't know when I was going to get there, but I decided I would. And every morning I wrote it down, I still want to be sober. I followed some suggestions, which are very similar to some of the things that I've learned in AA. Right? I ask myself some powerful questions every morning. What have I got to feel happy about right now? What can I be excited about right now? What can I be grateful for right now? What am I enjoying in my life right now? Who do I love and who loves me? I could never answer that one. I still struggle sometimes. But that's because I'd never learned what love was, right? But these powerful questions, and what I realize is when we focus on things in life, when we look for things, we start to see them. So however hard it was to feel grateful for things, when I look for things to be grateful for, I can find them. And likewise, when I look for things to feel happy about, excited about, to be enjoying, to be proud of, to be committed to, I can find them. And when we change the way we look at the world we look at changes. Amazingly, I'd spent my whole life looking for things to be fearful of, looking for people to criticize me and judge me, and therefore for me to be resentful of and angry with. I'd filled myself up with poison. What happened during a 9-month period before I came into AA was that I started this process of sort of cleansing and refocusing. I now see that's what I was doing. The other thing that happened, and this was during lockdown we had in the UK at that time with COVID in 2020, was that I realized that there was something about giving away. And this is one of the other paradoxes of AA, right? I mentioned suffering to heal, and I mentioned death to live, dying to live, death of the ego. Giving away, service, right? So important. Well, I discovered that in that 9 months. I didn't have it. I didn't know it was AA, and I've done a lot more since. But an idea came from somewhere. Well, you've applied for, by the way, my career had crashed and burned before this, right? I'd left a very, very good job to start a business. This is an important point. I left a good job to start a business, and that rock bottom I described wasn't just driven by drinking. I had lived with 3 years and no income, having had a big income, right? Because I was trying to start a business, and it had failed. And not only did it fail, I then applied for 35 jobs in the space of a year, and I put my heart, my soul, my energy into applying for every one of them. I got none of them. Right. So I was on my knees. Really important. So there I was on my knees, starting to ask myself these healthy questions and try and reframe the world. And I decided I was going to take all of this leadership training I'd had over the last 20 or 30 years, which I'd always had a passion for, and start giving it away for free to people who were struggling during lockdown. And I created a program for people and started giving away my services for free. And I met some fantastic people, amazing people from all over the world. And amazingly, I started to feel a bit better about myself. And after doing that for about 9 months, I suddenly realized that teaching people how to live a life with healthy thinking and to be authentic wasn't very authentic if I was still drinking. Right? Because I wasn't actually showing my real self to the world at all. Little Dave was still popping up a lot. Most days, most days. And so I stopped. But then, you see, prior to that, I'd had 4 years when as I said earlier, 4 years when, I think I said earlier, 4 years when I hadn't drunk. So how was I going to not drink again? And that was why I came back to AA. And when I did, having suffered enough, having been on my knees, I was ready to say, okay, I'll do what I need to do. What do I need to do? And I went to the first meeting and I heard the message. You need to come to meetings. You need to get a service position. You need to do the steps. And in order to do the steps, you need to find somebody to sponsor you and lead you and guide you through the steps. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm ready. I was so tired of the previous life. And I did those things. They were looking for a literature rep. I volunteered immediately at the first meeting. Very kind secretary phoned me up after the meeting and said, well, Dave, it's really good to have you at the meeting. We usually expect 6 months of sobriety for a literature position. And little Dave was mortified. I have a PhD. Don't you know who I am? He was furious. He had a sulk for a week. He was offered a chance to be a greeter. Greeter? What the hell's a greeter? There's no way little Dave is going to do anything as demeaning as greeting. But it was the best thing I did, and he did. And actually, the same person came and asked me to be the literature rep 6 months later. I was enjoying greeting so much, I didn't want to do it. I carried on greeting. And that was the beginning of the journey. The second meeting that I had, the same lady, lovely American lady called Sue, called me up after the meeting, said, Dave, have you got a sponsor yet? I'm like a week in or something. No, I haven't. Oh, you need to get one. So the first person I asked said no. Well, you can imagine how that went down with little Dave. Not well at all. Not well at all. But you see, I'd selected this person because they were a non-executive director on a company. And, so I thought, well, they obviously move in my kind of circles. But they said no. And so this little bald guy, he said to me, he wasn't the little bald guy. This guy said to me, I can't do it, but I suggest you ask this other person who's a little bald guy who's been sober since 1988. And I did, and he sort of said yes after a while and took me through the steps really quite quickly. And everybody goes through them at their own pace. But those steps have changed my life. They changed my life. And when I went through step 4 and realized how full of poison I was, how full of resentment and delusion I was, actually, I was shocked. I was shocked. And I had one night when I woke up at about 2 a.m, having listened a lot to Joe and Charlie. And if none of you have, give it a go. And so I'd woken up and I went down every single person in my list and I wished them all the joy and all the peace and all the love and all the serenity in their lives that I wanted for mine. Including that babysitter, including that mad father who I hadn't seen in 30 years, including all the people I thought had wronged me who hadn't really. And by the time I got to 6 o'clock in the morning, I hadn't slept much. I'd been going down that list in my head. The relief I felt, it was like the most massive weight lifting. It was unbelievable. And so for me, as I now reflect back on the steps, right, and step 4 was pivotal, but the other ones also, they've all been important, and I've revisited them a lot since. It's a process of letting go. It's just letting go. It's letting go of little Dave running the show. It's recognizing, and this is where I see God really, that I'm connected to something far bigger, and that I'd isolated myself from it very early on. And using drugs, alcohol, or anything else just makes me progressively more asleep, more unconscious, less able to connect with anybody or anything. And for me, the process of connecting with God was just a process of trying to, and eventually, again, what you get, you see, what we focus on, I tend to find, if I'm looking for it. And so if it's good things, I find good things. And when it's bad things, I find loads of those too. I'm going to share one little story from 3 years ago, not 3 years ago, from a year and a half ago or thereabout. No, it wasn't even that. It was my third anniversary, because little Dave's still there all the time, right? And so we have this wonderful newcomers meeting that I go to in Guildford. I've done service at, which was my first meeting. And we have a tradition when it's your anniversary, after the first year, you get to give this little bit of potted wisdom to the group. You have, a few minutes. Has anybody got an anniversary? They get asked, and yes, I've got 2 years, or I've got 3 years, or whatever. And how did you do it? And so there's this chance to sort of share your wisdom with the group. So I was looking forward to this. Little Dave was all over it, right? And I'm thinking about it every day the week before, and got to the day itself. I'm in the shower in the morning and I thought up some really, really fantastic things I was going to say, very briefly, but they were really spot on. And I get to the meeting And it's a huge meeting that night. There were about 60 or 70 people there. And I'm sat there and I'm waiting for this moment where they ask, has anybody got an anniversary of 2 years or more? And finally, the secretary asks. And bless her, if somebody called Karen didn't put her hand up and say, yes, I've got 12 years. Okay. And she talked for a long time. And it was a big meeting. And little Dave's going, bloody hell, get on with it, won't you? Do any of you have the voice that, if the whole world could hear what was going on in my head, it would be dreadful. But little Dave's going, bloody hell, get on with it. God, I'm going to have no time left for me. And you haven't said anything worth saying anyway. God, that was all a ramble. Come on, come on, come on. So that you can imagine that playing out, right? And there's a bit of resentment, but there's still time left for little Dave to say his piece. Okay, so she finishes, and I'm thinking, here I go. But no, Tommy from Glasgow. Tommy's got 38 years. Tommy from Glasgow with 38 years. Well, fuck me. So, of course, by the time Tommy finishes, and I have to say he was quite quick, little Dave is just beside himself and goes, he doesn't say little Dave, he says, I'm Dave, I'm an alcoholic, 3 years. And everything they just said. and the meeting was ruined for me. I sat there stewing, and at one point later in the meeting, there was a chance to share. So I threw out my bit of potted wisdom on the back of the right moment, which wasn't the right moment at all. And I drove home feeling pissed off. And then I realized I needed to talk to another alcoholic. And I needed to explain just how mad this guy is. And I did. And do you know what? That was the Friday. On the Sunday, we had my other home group meeting. It was a beautiful meeting. I heard probably the best speaker I've ever heard. And unusually for little Dave and me, I sat there and thought, I can't share back, right? It was just so good. I've got nothing to say. And then I knew what I had to say. I had to tell people about this mad egoic problem I'd had on Friday. Most of them had been there at that meeting, so I had to fess up and confess and tell everybody just how crazy I am. And it was perfect. And I now see that was all part of the plan in the first place, right? That was all part of God's plan, was just to kind of put me in that position and get me to do that. I know I'm almost at the end of my time, but I do want to tell a couple of things, because after that sort of major crash and burn I had, where I had no job, and give me a thumbs up if you can't hear the awful dinging that I've got going on here. Good, thank God for that. It's very noisy. What happened after I'd had that sort of rock bottom of applying for 35 jobs and not getting them, and finally kind of coming to my senses after all those decades, finally getting into AA and doing the program, suddenly things started happening in my life that I could never have expected. I'm now the chairman of a very large listed company. It came out of nowhere. I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't looking for it. I was also the CEO of that company for a while. I wasn't looking for that either. I wasn't expecting it. And at every point, what was happening in my life was, thankfully, little Dave wasn't there at those moments, because I've learned to ask God to tell me what God thinks I should do, and then wait. And sometimes I have to wait for days, right? And I've had to learn to push the pause button and not do the thing that little Dave would always have me do and jump in as fast as possible, but to just wait. And the answers come. And when I'm trying to do something that isn't to do with serving the interests of little Dave, when I'm genuinely trying to do the right thing, it leads to good stuff. So I do believe that if you give it away, it comes back. It's like a boomerang, but you have to give it away in a completely loving, unconditional way. So we suffer to heal, we surrender to win, we die to live, we give it away to receive it. And a very wise person said to me recently, coming back to the human condition and little Dave, there are the 4 delusions of the human mind. I'm independent. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I've proven to myself I can't be independent of all of you and of everybody else. And it's a nonsense. And the whole idea of independence is the root of the ego. That idea of being separate and building up that separate personality is a delusion, and it's wrong. I'm invincible. No, I'm not. I thought I was, but I'm definitely not. There are all sorts of consequences. I'm not invincible. And the third one is I'm in control. No, I'm not. Something else is. And the more I try and control things, the worse it gets. And I'm going to stop there.
Everything you do, the answer lies inside you.